welcome to the Daily Space. My name is Annie Wilson, and most weekdays, the CosmoQuest team is here putting science into your brain. Today, however, is for Rocket Roundup. Let's get to it, shall we? First up, because we know you're going to ask about it, is the SN10 hop. On Wednesday, March 3rd, SpaceX's Starship SN10 took to the air from Boca Chica, Texas in a successful 10-kilometer test flight. The vehicle was scheduled to perform its hop earlier in the day at 20:15 UTC, but that attempt was aborted at engine ignition. Speaking on Twitter after the abort, SpaceX CEO Elon Musk stated that the launch abort was because of a slightly conservative high thrust limit on the vehicle's Raptor engines. SpaceX engineers changed the limit and fueled the vehicle for a second attempt about 2 hours later. The SpaceX webcast went live 10 minutes before launch with famed nominal SpaceX engineer John Insprucker as host. Finally, at 23:14 UTC, SN10 ignited its 3 Raptor engines and took to the air, taking 4 minutes to reach its planned apogee. Along the way, 2 Raptor engines were shut down to reduce flight loads. At this early phase in testing, and with people's houses less than 3 kilometers from the pad, the flights are limited to subsonic velocity. These shutdowns were punctuated by brief gushes of flame as unburnt propellant hit the hot metal of the engines. This was expected. Don't panic. At apogee, the craft hung in the air on the blue Mach Diamond thrust of a single Raptor engine until that engine was shut down to begin descent. As it began the transition to horizontal flight, the vehicle dumped excess liquid in a dramatic but planned cloud of gas. As it descended, the vehicle controlled its attitude with the fore and aft flaps. Everything appeared to go normally, which is a SpaceX term originating from a misspeak during a webcast, during this portion of the flight. Once it was under 2 kilometers in altitude, the vehicle prepared to perform its flip and landing maneuver. At about 500 meters altitude, the vehicle relit all 3 of its engines. This is a change from the previous flight profile. All engines successfully ignited, and the leeward engine immediately shut off after the flip. This engine has the least leverage in gimbal to flip the vehicle vertical and is only used if the other engines fail to ignite, which has happened before on the flights of SN8 and SN9. After transitioning from being on its side back to being vertical for landing, it shut off the other engine and did the final landing burn with a single engine. This allowed for the best control of the vehicle's descent without having to resort to deep throttling, which complicates engine design. Unlike the Falcon 9, Starship incorporates a low thrust to weight ratio portion in its landing burn, and one engine allows this. It touched down harder than planned and at a slight angle, but it was still standing on the landing pad when the dust cleared. This was the first full Starship test vehicle to land successfully after the flights of SN8 and SN9 that both exploded upon landing. Amateur post-landing analysis of the footage showed that the 2 of the 6 landing legs did not latch, which would explain why SN10 was leaning just a bit after touchdown. Several days later, this was confirmed by a tweet from Elon Musk, who went on to explain the hard landing happened because the SN10 engine was low on thrust, due probably to partial helium ingestion from the fuel header tank. Impact of 10 meters per second crushed legs and part of the skirt, which led to this 8 minutes after landing.
Thank y'all very much. That was very exhilarating. Oh, it just blew up! Oh my god, dude! Oh god! Here comes the explosion. Get ready, guys.
We'll be back with another SpaceX launch after the break. On March 4th at 8:24 UTC, a SpaceX Falcon 9 lofted another 60 satellites to orbit from LC-39A at the Kennedy Space Center. This was the 8th flight for booster 1049, becoming only the second Falcon 9 first stage to reach this milestone. It successfully landed on the barge Of Course I Still Love You, stationed 633 kilometers downrange. After a brief coast phase, the second stage restarted. The 4 tension rods that kept the 60 Starlink satellites secure during the ascent were released, and the newest Starlink train was deployed into orbit. This launch was originally scheduled for February 2nd, but it was delayed 12 times for technical and weather reasons, including an indefinite delay for all Falcon 9 launches, following the loss of booster 1059 during landing on February 16th. Following the investigation, which concluded that the loss was due to damage to a heat shield, L-17 was rescheduled to launch on February 28th. They didn't go to space that day. The countdown was aborted at T minus 1 minute and 24 seconds. While a reason for the abort hasn't been announced as of press time, we do know that it occurred during the final engine chill around the time when the cryo-helium loading sequence normally ends. Merlin engines have completed 1,174 engine flights across 109 Falcon 9 and 3 Falcon Heavies, with only 3 in-flight failures: CRS-1, Starlink 6, and Starlink 18. 2/3 of the engine failures happening on Starlink missions seems a bit suspicious, until you realize that SpaceX only uses boosters that have flown many times for the Starlink flights. The new or barely used boosters are reserved for external customers. This lets SpaceX demonstrate that the boosters are good for many uses while not passing the risk on to paying customers. Some issues may happen, but they only negatively impact SpaceX. In any case, the primary missions of Starlink 6 and 18 were successful, deploying the satellites into their intended orbits. Anyways, on to the good stuff.
T minus 30 seconds. T minus 15 seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition.
Vehicle is pitching downrange.
There weren't a lot of launches this past week, but there was a lot of an amazing history to celebrate. After the break, we'll be back with This Week in Rocket History. This week in Rocket History, we once again have a carryover from last week, but this time of year seems to be very popular for launches, or at least it used to be. On March 3rd, 1972 at 1:49 UTC, Pioneer 10 launched on top of an Atlas Centaur SLV-3C with a Star 37E third stage, the first time this configuration had been flown. After third stage burnout, the spacecraft was traveling at 14.4 kilometers per second. At the time, it was the fastest man-made object ever to leave the Earth-Moon system. It passed the moon's orbit after only 11 hours and passed Mars's orbit after just 12 weeks. Pioneer 10 had a number of firsts. It was the first spacecraft to travel to the asteroid belt, the first to make a close observation of Jupiter, and the first to leave the solar system on June 13th, 1983. Until it was outpaced by Voyager 1 in 1998, it was the farthest man-made object from Earth. Pioneer 10 was also key to making a number of significant scientific discoveries and observations, including measuring the magnetic fields in interplanetary space, the nature of Jupiter's magnetic field, and the composition of solar wind. As Pioneer 10 was the first spacecraft to pass through the asteroid belts, scientists were not actually sure how dense the belt was. Smaller asteroids could not be detected from Earth, and there was a substantial fear that millimeters wide particles were common, and that passing through the belt could end up being catastrophic for the spacecraft. Shortly after, it was discovered that while much smaller particles were indeed 3 times more common in the asteroid belt than they were in the space near Earth, fragments larger than 1 millimeter were not to be found and were probably extremely rare. During the Jupiter encounter, the spacecraft malfunctioned due to the high radiation environment around the planet, but most systems recovered. Only some images of Io and Jupiter were lost. During the encounter, the spacecraft took high-resolution pictures of Jupiter. The quality of the images it sent back was higher than anything that had been seen before. And the presentation of the images would later earn the Pioneer Program an Emmy Award. After the Jovian encounter, Pioneer 10 went on to travel past the orbits of the rest of the outer planets, finally passing the farthest planet, which at the time was Neptune, on June 13th, 1983. Its mission officially ended on March 31st, 1997, but contact was maintained with the spacecraft to receive telemetry, which continued pouring in intermittently until the final signal was received on January 23rd, 2003. It is currently estimated to be about 128 astronomical units from the sun, traveling at approximately 2 astronomical units a year, or 12 kilometers a second. We'll be back with stats and this week's space fact. Stay tuned. To wrap things up, here's a running tally of a few spaceflight statistics for the current year. There are currently 5 toilets in space. 3 are installed on the ISS, 1 on the Crew Dragon, and 1 on the Soyuz. There have been 18 total orbital launch attempts so far this year, including 1 failure. 424 satellites have been launched into orbit, with over half of those being Starlinks. I keep track of orbital launches by where they launched from, also known as spaceport. Here's that breakdown. USA 8, China 5, Kazakhstan 2, India 1, New Zealand 1, Russia 1. And our space fact for the week is that the late James Doohan, who played Scotty on the original Star Trek, has in fact gone to space more than once. Well, his remains have. As reported by The Verge, his first trip on a rocket was aboard SpaceX's Falcon 1 Flight 3 back in 2008. Unfortunately, that rocket failed a few minutes after launch. Despite official requests to bring Doohan's ashes on the International Space Station having been denied, in 2008, Richard Garriott, one of the first space tourists, smuggled some of his ashes along with a laminated picture of Doohan up to the International Space Station. This was done without the knowledge of anyone else except for Doohan's family. He hid the picture and the ashes under the floor of the Columbus module. It was completely clandestine, Garriott told the Times of London. His family were very pleased that the ashes made it up there, but we were all disappointed we didn't get to talk about it publicly for so long. Now enough time has passed that we can. And in 2012, an urn with some of his ashes flew on a SpaceX Falcon 9. According to the Times, Doohan's ashes have traveled some 1.7 billion miles across space and have orbited the Earth more than 70,000 times. James Doohan isn't the only person whose ashes have gone to space. In 2006, the ashes of Clyde Tombaugh, the discoverer of Pluto, were placed in an aluminum capsule on the New Horizons spacecraft, which visited Pluto in 2015. Ad Astra, James Doohan, and Clyde Tombaugh. This has been the Daily Space.